Hello, my name is Piotr Kolonov and I'm the CEO of Dataedo. Welcome to our webinar on the foundational attributes of Business Glossary. Today we have George Firican. George is not the first time with us in webinars about the Business Glossary. He's an expert on data governance and business glossaries in particular. So that would be his third presentation on this topic. I encourage you to go to our website and see his past presentations. There's a lot of interesting content over there. George is a director of data governance and business intelligence at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver. He's also a founder and owner of the Lights on Data blog, training and consulting. So that's it for the introduction. Welcome, George.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Piotr. It's lovely to be here and present on this topic. It's really one of my favorites. I do want to mention, if you don't know me already, I can tell you that I'm really very passionate about data governance and data management in general. So I tend to be a frequent speaker and writer, contributor, YouTuber. And as much as possible, I do try to provide practical information to help you with your data governance and data management questions and challenges. So please feel free to also ask away during today's webinar. Please do feel free again to check out lightsondata.com, where I feature some great contributors as well. If you prefer content in video format, check out my YouTube channel where I post a video each week. So there will be one coming up later today, or just follow me on LinkedIn and I promise you will not be disappointed. So before we go into really those foundational attributes, I want to make sure that we are on the same page with what a business glossary means, right? So one of the most common definitions for it is that it's a collection of business terms with their unique definitions and other useful related information. So there are three keywords here. There's business, unique, and information. Right? So we're talking about the business terms, the business language, business verbiage, or whatever synonym you want to use. We're talking about having a common place, a trusted source of information where anyone can go to understand business terminologies within your organization, and even other relevant information around these terms that provide us with a better understanding, better context, better meaning, and really usage around them. And that's where we're going to see of what other information is, what those attributes we should capture besides the definition itself. Now, I think we're somewhat familiar, right, with business glossaries in general, because we can really find them in documents, in contract systems, spreadsheets, books, manuals, and they sort of look something like this, right? These are just three examples I pulled out of different artifacts. Now, what we're usually accustomed to in business glossaries is that we see the term on the left-hand side and the definition next to it, right? Simple concept. And when somebody does start a business glossary within their company, they tend to follow this this formula as well. But really, it's not enough. It's not enough to make it a strong business glossary. You need a little bit more. Obviously, a tool can help with that, and Dataedo has this great business glossary tool, amongst other things as well. This is just an example, but I want to again reiterate the fact that it doesn't just include that term and the definition, but all these other attributes that will go into it. Now, for the purpose of this webinar, I want to give you some examples as well that follow these attributes. So I want to take the term address and its definition, which is the particulars of the physical place where a person or organization can be found or contacted. Now, your definition might be different, but let's just use this for the purpose of this webinar. Okay. Now, the foundational attributes that I'm going to talk about today, they're those attributes that should be included in the first iteration. If you've already started a business glossary, make sure you do have them. And if not, maybe you might want to consider to include them in your next improvement phase. Now, These foundational attributes are really needed, not just to have a strong business glossary, but I really think that it increases its usability overall and user adoption. Well, you'll see it really makes it easier to maintain. So let's go right into that first attribute, which is really the tracking the status. This might be pretty obvious, and if you do have a tool, this is sort of a default attribute that you will get out of the box for the most part. If you don't, if you're starting with a spreadsheet, for example, some sort of a list, some sort of a SharePoint custom list, for example, then you will need to add this yourself. But this really is tracking that stage that a term is at, and it should be a required field. Now, you should at least have the following values: drafted, published, and retired. Out of the three, probably the first two would be used the most, drafted or published. So you're either working on it or it's up and ready for people to consume it. But you can have many more other stages as well. And I've seen this lovely number appear often. By the way, if you're interested in finding out more about each one of these stages and how you can go from one stage to another, what the process is, what the considerations are, who owns what, who participates in what, how they differ, I'm sure we can create another webinar about it if there's enough interest. So do let us know. Okay. Whatever you choose here, though, is really make sure these are also defined, they're consistent, it's really clear when you do move from one to another. The second attribute that should be included in that first iteration is the owner, the ownership, which is really that entity who, again, has that ownership over the definition of the term. So, and not only, but anytime there's updates, not just to the definition, but also the attributes that will follow this owner should be giving their stamp of approval. The great thing about it, and you might have recalled from one of the previous webinars if you've watched it. If not, again, I encourage you to look at the previous ones to see all the breadth of benefits that a business glossary brings to an organization. But one of those, let's say, unintended consequences, but beautiful, great consequences, is that having a business glossary does bring in that ownership that is really crucial as part of the data governance program, data stewardship programs. And why? Again, because as you're drafting these definitions, as you're wanting to publish them, somebody should give their stamp of approval. Somebody should take that ownership over it, and other things related to the term and its definition itself. Now, it can be a department, so it could be the marketing department, the finance department, sales, even IT in some cases. It could be a specific role within a department, within an organization, or you can actually just call out an individual themselves. Now, or obviously you can have a combination of all these, all three, some of them. It's really your choice. It's up to you on how you want to structure it. Ideally, you would tie all of this to some sort of an asset, Active Directory, that then you don't need to really maintain these reference values yourself. You just tie it to your organization's directory. Now, as a best practice, you should go for the role when it comes to tracking the ownership. Why? Well, because department can be a bit too vague, right? So if you're mentioning, well, it's the marketing department that owns this term. Well, who from the marketing department? It would probably be the director or somebody higher up, but it can depend. It's not always the director that's the owner. So having tracking it just at the department level might yield a number of other questions, right? And when you're trying to get in touch with that owner, or when you're trying to set up an approval process, it can get wieldy, right? You want to track it to an individual per se. But if you track it to a specific individual, let's say George Firican from the marketing department, well, George can change departments, right? she can move from one department to another to advance their career, to change their career, what have you. And that ownership should not follow the individual, but it should really follow the role, right? So let's say it's always the director of the marketing department. And if it's George or another person, it doesn't matter. It really sticks with the role. And again, of course, we want to make sure that we know that the director of marketing department is George. So that's why it's always great, if possible, to tie it to some sort of a Active Directory type of a thing. Okay. Now in our instance with the address, it could be the records manager, for example, but it can very well be the director of sales, marketing, and so forth. Okay, the third one now is the data steward. This is really that individual that's maintaining the term, right? They're the subject matter expert, which should be consulted in regards to any data, any processes, any reports, dashboards that make use of this term, right? They should really be the go-to person because they have a lot of knowledge working hands-on with the term and the data related to it. Similar to the owner, you can have the name tied to an individual or their role, not so much the department. What's different from the ownership, though, is let's say you actually are lucky enough that do have a data stewardship role in your organization. Well, you can have multiple as well. If you have one, you probably have two as well. And if that's the case, then you don't want to just tie it to the role because you want to ensure you understand which one of the two roles, let's say, is really the data steward for this one. So again, a combination of the two can help. Even bringing in the department as well can bring a little bit more context. I mean, more information never really hurt anybody. In our case, in the address example, it could be the records coordinator, assuming that the owner will be the records manager. All right, now the next three, I think they're very obvious attributes, but they are often missed. Let me just blur this out for a second because there's too many things here on the board. So the synonym, obviously, it's a term with the same meaning of an already defined term name. Simple. If you do have multiple synonyms, I recommend separating them by a semicolon, unless you're using a dedicated software, a dedicated tool that allows you to record these synonyms separately. But again, if you're tracking it on paper, on Excel, in Word document, what have you, just to start with, then make sure you have a clear separation between them. And I will go against commas because, as we know, if we ever need to export this data in Excel, commas can create havoc. But whatever you choose, whatever that delimiter is, just make sure you're consistent. Okay, the abbreviation, that's again simple. It's the shortened form of term name. And lastly, well, the acronym, right? It's the abbreviation from the first initial letters of other words and pronounced as a word. Now, if your organization is like the ones I've worked for in the past and currently working on as well, then you're using a lot of acronyms, right? You're encountering a lot of acronyms. At first, I really felt I was working for a military organization. Everybody was talking in code. I remember this one conversation or note that I did get in my first few days, one of my previous jobs, and the manager mentioned that, George, the CPC metric requires an immediate CTA, so we need to do something about it ASAP. So let's meet this afternoon in the FRB building to discuss. Yeah, I did not understand much. I did know ASAP though, right? I thought, okay, well, that means as soon as possible. Well, I was wrong because in this particular organization, ASAP meant as simple as possible. There you go. So really, I didn't understand much. By the way, it really means that the CPC stands for cost per click. So the cost per click metric requires an immediate call to action. So we need to do something about it as simple as possible. So let's meet this afternoon in the FRB. I forgot what was standing for. It was the name of a building. It was Frederick R. Oh, and funny enough, B from FRB standard for building. So it kind of reads like building, building. Doesn't make sense, but again, this organization did love the TLAs, 3-letter acronyms. And I really think this is one of those really overlooked attributes that should be included in your first iteration. If you don't have it already in your existing business glossary, make sure you're adding it, because it will ease the onboarding and training of new employees and really speed up their understanding of your organization's TLAs. All right, so as an example here for the address, we can have a synonym as the physical mailing address. I'd be curious, by the way, to see if you've seen any other synonyms for address. But if I have encountered this one, physical mailing address, just to not be confused with the emailing address. Then abbreviation ADDR and the acronym PMA, standing for physical mailing address. Now, the definition source. This is the origin of the definition, where your current definition is obtained from or inspired by, right? This is not mandatory, so you should only fill it out if it is applicable. Normally, this can that source can be a specific policy from within your organization or a regulatory body, or it could be an external source, and let's say really trusted third party, a really trusted external source like the IRS maybe, or some sort of an ISO standard, or again, another regulatory body or some sort of an organization, or it could be the individual as well. So if this definition came in as a recommendation from maybe the president of your company or even the board, it would be nice to add that in there as the source. Okay. Now, there's a few reasons why this definition source attribute is very important to have. First of all, having that in there when you're drafting out that definition, when you're filling out, putting in a new entry in your business glossary, I think it really serves as a reminder to not reinvent the wheel, right? To remind people that, listen, maybe just try and do your homework first and see what else has been done already that's available, that you don't need to think of it from just starting from scratch. It just really makes the process easier of drafting something out. It also helps bring some trustworthiness in the whole process, especially during the approval stages. So when it goes to the owner, when the data stewards are looking at it as well, it really shows them that you've done your homework and looked at the other sources and how they defined it. Okay, the definition, of course, it doesn't need to be verbatim or by word in order to reference it as a source. It can, again, just act as an inspiration. And this is really, I find it to be a productivity hack. It greatly reduces the number of iterations you would need to do with this definition from the draft version to the published approved version. Why? Well, for certain terms, you can have countless meetings just to talk about that one definition. Or even if you have, just a one meeting, it can take a long time, right? So what usually happens, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 45 minutes into the meeting, somebody will ask, we've been talking about this for quite some time. We've been debating about this for quite some time. What did other organizations do? So having that in there, it really speeds up that conversation, reduces the time needed to get that consensus on the final version. So in our example with the address, our definition source is actually the ISO standard and USPS, that's the US Postal Service. Okay. Now the taxonomy. This is all up to you on how you would like to categorize your business terms. The most common one is really based on the business hierarchy, so the organizational structure and the type of departments you have. You can also have different categories if you choose to do so, or you can have tags, some sort of a tagging system, like in a blog, let's say. Now, do keep in mind that even if the category identifies the term as part of a business unit, it doesn't mean that they are also the owner. So for example, a staff member might fall under HR as an organizational structure or from the organizational structure point, but its owner could be the data governance council themselves. Okay. Obviously, it also depends on the data model you might be following, but don't worry about being too rigid about this to start. It can tend to be a bottleneck when you're thinking of, okay, how am I going to categorize these terms? And I've done this mistake before. I've even consulted with librarians, right? People that are really knowledgeable about ways to categorize things, and I think they were getting overwhelmed as well because there's so many domains to tackle and so many ways of looking at it. You can really go so many ways, and you can really be very granular in the way you might want to track this. But it's a bit of a mistake because it does add a bit of unnecessary complexity. I think it really depends, again, on your structure, on your organization, on your data model. So maybe to begin with, just start at the high level and see what works, and then you can always refine things, add more levels as you go along, as you're adding more terms into your business glossary. So as an example for ours, it could be that it's the records department, right? Because we had the records manager, records coordinator. It could be marketing, sales again, or you can even categorize it as contact data, customer data, whatever you choose. Now, one of the reasons, again, to have this taxonomy in there, to have this attribute, is it allows you with new ways to really segment and view your business glossary. And especially when you have, let's say more than 100 terms, it's not enough just to see things alphabetically. Sometimes you might want to filter things out based on a specific department. Maybe you want to find out all the data stewards related to a specific department. Maybe you want to find out all types of contact data, for example, and see what else might be useful in there for you to find if you don't remember the exact term name that you're looking for. So we can help you create all these different views. It can also help if you have a dedicated tool software to help provide different access to different roles. And that's more for editing rights, because for viewing rights, it really should be open to everybody in the organization at least. And that's really my recommendation. Okay. Now, last but not least, the last updated date. Again, if you're using a tool, this is usually an automatically generated field, but regardless, it represents the date when changes were last done for the term. I think it also helps with the timeliness and latency and relevancy factors and increases trust, right? It places the term in a timeline context. Of course, again, with a tool, you can also have when the term was first added, when it was published, when it was reviewed, when it was retired. But for start, make sure you at least have that last updated date. So anytime you're changing not just the status, but one of the values for the attributes and definitely the definition, that last updated date would refresh, or you will need to refresh it yourself if, again, you're using a spreadsheet. So simply in our example, that would be today's date. Now, as a high level, these are really those attributes that we went over. That should be part of that foundational first iteration of your business glossary. And again, if you don't have them already, you should include them in your next improvement phase. I'll leave these here. Obviously, you can access the recording afterwards, so you can see these examples. Now, best practice, these ones should be mandatory fields. Always fill them out, besides, of course, the term name and definition as well. And also, these ones should be drop-down fields. So just to tie them to a reference table to make sure you're not going to just put in everything in there that you would like, type in anything. Ideally, you would tie them back to tables that are maintained and defined. Though I do want to say in the beginning, again, up until maybe you get up to 100 terms, you can have these maybe besides the status, but the other ones you can have them as free text just to see what sort of things arise, what sort of things you would need to type in, and then just to start to create those reference tables based on the inputs that you've gotten so far. Okay, so really having these in there really creates that really strong foundation that you should have. One last attribute that I don't have on the slide, but I do want to mention is if you're a multinational, right? If you're in an international organization, you might want to track your business glossary terms in different languages as well. So if that's the case with you, make sure you also have an attribute that says language. Sometimes there are different instances of the business glossary depending on the language, but that can be tricky, and you want to make sure that there's always reconciliation between the terms and they're referencing the same thing. So ideally, you will still have the one instance of the business glossary, but then you will also have a way to differentiate the language that you're defining that term in. And again, that's used for just creating different views for different regions of the world, right? That whatever that language would apply to. So coming back to a previous slide, this is sort of how some of these attributes will look like in a dedicated tool such as Dataedo's. But of course, I think Piotr will go over in some of these, but they're flexible. That's a good thing. As I mentioned in other webinars too, the benefit of having a tool is that it's not really just about the business glossary, but it has other benefits of tying it to a data dictionary as well. And there's obviously great benefits there for both the technical and the business teams. All right, now it's time to go into a demo, and then we'll go into a poll and see some questions and answers.
Thanks, George. That was really good. Yes, I have already a couple of questions, but before we go into answering them, I will like to give you all a very quick demo. I promise it won't take long. Then I'd like to ask you a simple question with a poll, and then we can move to the questions. I'd like to show you the tool, but before I do, I'd like to brag a little. Very recently, we asked our clients to give us reviews on Gartner Peer Insights site. This is the enterprise software catalog when they verify all the reviews. So I would like to tell you that our tool, it's somewhere here. Over here, has the highest rate of all those big players, including Colibra, IBM, all the Informaticas and Microsofts of the world. So I'm very happy to show that. That's why I wanted to brag a little, even Microsoft. So yeah, let me show the tool that is the best according to clients on Gartner. Just maybe 2 minutes, a quick overview. So Dataedo is a data catalog software where you can collect your business and technical metadata in business glossaries. So this is something you've seen on the screen today. This is the business glossary. Here's another one. And here I have a technical metadata imported from the, let's open this one up, imported from live data sources. All the key details are imported from the databases and all kinds of sources. And data stewards and architects can annotate that with different descriptions. They can explain data model, how the data relates one to another. And you can build and link a business glossary on top of that. So just to build a business glossary, it doesn't take a tool, in my opinion. You can use an Excel, you can use a Word or any kind of tool. George, there is a question about that. You'll address that later on, hopefully.
Yeah.
But I believe the simple business glossary is a quite simple idea. It's difficult to define, but it's very simple to put together. If you have the data, so the definitions are the definitions are difficult to define and how to come up with the terms themselves. But the tool is very powerful when you would like to link those relationships together. So this is the term. You can see this in a hierarchy, in a hierarchical view. So these are the attributes you can define up to 100 of them. So depending on your needs. And what's very interesting is that you can navigate actually and define the relationships, like it has a specific type or a synonym, right? You can use a synonym as a field, right? So like here, and you can also put them together and have a navigation. And what's specifically difficult to do in Excel is the mapping to the data models, to the technical metadata, to all the data that is actually somewhere in your organization. So this is particularly powerful, and this is where Dataedo can help you a lot if you'd like to build a glossary, share it, and explain how it links to the physical data. So this is some you can also search easily and share it with your colleagues. So if you're looking for a customer, then you can see all the definitions and all the tables inside your databases. And here we have definitions. The editor, you can see that fields are drop downs. They are open. They can be closed lists, right? So you can add new entries. So it's quite quite useful. And you can add your own attributes over here. As I said, up to 100 fields. So I think 100 is enough for everyone.
Yeah.
Most, right? Okay, I think that's it. I would like to take too much of your time right now. If you'd like to learn more about the tool, you will receive a link after this webinar with a presentation with a webinar I recorded some time ago. Actually, there are a couple of them. If you'd like to learn more, you can find something interesting on our website. Yeah, when you answer the poll, we can have a quick summary of that. You can use the questions tab to ask questions. We already have a couple of them, so feel free to complete the poll. And George, I suggest we move on to the questions right now.
All right.
The questions, I will read the questions Joyce asked. She said she cannot see the questions. I will read them, and George will provide the answers. We have already a couple of them. There's an interesting one from Caesar. The question is, how do data owner and steward interrelate? Who has the final decision on whether changing or not?
Okay, thank you for the question, Caesar. I assume about changing, you're meaning the change of the values for the attributes or the definition themselves. So it really depends based on your organization. Normally, it's really that steward that let's say takes that first pass and gets that draft in as close to the final version as possible, right? Because they are usually on the ground, really working with either data or reports or processes that are involving that term. So they have a lot of knowledge, a lot of insight that they bring to the table, a lot of considerations that they bring to the table, at least at the operational level. So they should be the ones taking that first pass, and they're really the ones making that recommendation to the owner to approve. So it is the owner that should have that final decision at the end, right? Because in the end, they should be the ones responsible for multiple reasons, right? They have more responsibility overall, and they also should have maybe more of that business context overall, organization-wide, or at least specific to their own department, that they can again give that stamp of approval or let the steward know if maybe there's something that they've missed. But in the end, I mean, when it comes to a project as well, right? Let's say the IT department is buying a tool, or it's a business that's purchasing a new service. In the end, even though you have those knowledge experts, They're providing all that input. They're doing all the legwork. They're looking at the pros and cons and everything, and they're coming with a recommendation to really the owner, to the head of the department, or what have you. Again, it's the head that says yes or no, considering all the pros and cons that they have ahead of them. So it's, again, the owner that should have that final decision.
Okay, thank you. We have a question that was, I hope I already answered. So Nicole asked, what tool or programs can you use to publish Business Glossary? Is there something digital searchable? So the quick answer is Dataedo. The longer answer is it depends how complex you want it to be. So my opinion is, if it's just a glossary, use a spreadsheet or a wiki or some kind of. Yes. George, would you like to add something?
Yeah. So I've seen anything, from starting with a spreadsheet, and that's really the easiest way to start with. Though it's better to start than not start at all, right? So definitely the spreadsheet is the lowest cost, but it has a few issues. I mean, first of all, it is a spreadsheet, so you need to deal with really managing it, making sure you're dealing with the version control, how you're going to make it accessible, how are you going to connect it to other assets. It can work in the beginning, but it should not be a long-term solution. And then, Piotr, like you mentioned, yes, things like Wiki and SharePoint. I've seen other content management systems or knowledge sharing systems like Moodle and Elg. So whatever you might be using for your intranet, it can work. But again, that usually requires some customization, so you need to maintain that. And it's not as malleable because obviously it's not a data governance dedicated tool.
Okay, thanks.
So yes, I mean the best bet, and really, even though you think, well, that will cost a little bit of money, in the long run, if you count the number of hours that you need to put in maintaining all these other tools, going for a dedicated tool really saves you a lot in the long run. And it would really also improve that adoption, because that's also something you want to consider when you're looking at where should I store all of this. Is it easily accessible to the end user? Are they, do they like using the tool or not? That's one big consideration. You want to have adoption for the Business Glossary. You don't want to just have a repository where you're dumping things, even though they're good. They might not be used just because it's cumbersome to do so.
Okay. Let's move to the next one. Angel asks, what role Business Glossary plays within a data governance framework?
Well, a few things. I mean, it is really one of those main artifacts that comes out of the data governance program. And again, it's because it's creating that consensus on the common business terms. It really creates that trusted source, common source of information when it comes to business verbiage. So, and as I mentioned before, it tied to the ownership attribute, it enforces that ownership, and that ownership isn't just to the business term, but it tends to spread to have ramifications into other things. So even processes and right, the whole data, the supply chain, and reports related to it. Usually they can be interconnected, and it's a great way to start to identify a specific owner, and then of course stewards as well.
Okay. Lee asks, how do you address the issue of business users who are keen to upload business terms into a glossary, but do not wish to accept or assign an owner? Interesting one.
Okay. So again, this is, I guess, depending on how you want to set it up. So you can have it that anybody can submit terms into the glossary, and they automatically maybe go into a draft state. Or you can have a different other process where it's sent to maybe a data stewardship group, if you have any, and they're the ones that take that first pass at it, and they're also the ones maybe making recommendations of who the owner should be. Okay, so it really again depends. It depends on whatever process you want to adopt. But normally, I think that can be a good enough start, just to have the stakeholders submit ideas, because it also brings up issues. It brings up where maybe there's problems that need to be addressed. It brings up the needs that they're trying to resolve. So having them submit draft definitions, even though they don't have that owners attached to them, I think it's a good start. And then it's up to the data governance lead or the data stewards to help bring forward recommendations of what that owner should look like. And some of these, if they're not decided at the working group level, they can be brought up to the data governance steering committee, council, whatever you're calling it.
Yeah, but what if they do not accept the owner who was selected by the committee? I think that was the question.
Oh, sorry. So, well, yeah. So, again, it's how you're choosing to set it up. But what I've seen in the past, if things are not being really accepted at that working level, if they don't want to be the owner, for example, if they don't want to really be the owner, they should not be forced to be the owner in most cases, because they will not have that ongoing engagement in the end, and they might just approve things without looking, and that's really not serving anybody. Or it could really come from the top above them, and they're being told, no, this is really part of your responsibilities, you have to take it on. So then they're forced on taking that responsibility and being held accountable for it. If again that does not exist, they shouldn't be forced into it by the working group. And all these things should be bubbled up again at the Data Governance Council. And in some instances, maybe it's a council that wants to take that ownership overall, and they say, okay, fine, if we can't find somebody trustworthy that can take this on, maybe we'll just treat it at the council level. But normally it should be okay. I mean, it's a lengthy conversation on how data governance plays a whole role into it, and it can be a slow, bumpy start for sure.
Okay, we have a question from Bernard, out of which you could build your entire webinar. So how can we collate a business glossary? We are expected to take the critical data elements from our ERP and build it as a business glossary. Or is it something, do we need to have a glossary sourcing campaign? Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe you mentioned this on our previous webinar about the introduction. How do you actually get the terms? How do you get the list? I believe that's the question.
Yeah, there are a lot of ways of starting this, right? So I mean, you can take it from starting with data models and even data dictionaries. So industry data models, logical data models, and yes, data dictionaries as well, if that's already done first. Some data dictionaries, the terms, the names include sort of rough definitions, more for the technical teams to consume. So that can be a good starting point. You can also look into different technical and business documentations, training manuals for the systems that you're using. That can also be a good starting point. You can look at project documentations on your intranet's website, emails. There's definitely, I think, a lot that your organization is already doing. If a business glossary is not in place already, a lot of these definitions and terms are flying around. They're referenced in reports. Somebody has some sort of an idea of what it is. And again, look for those authority organizations, right? Governmental organization, industry standards. Look at apps.irs.gov, for example, and they have a lengthy glossary in there that can serve as an inspiration. So you can tackle this in many ways. I think the thing to remember is that it's better to start small. Just start with a handful of terms, and start building trust in the level of proficiency that you're providing in there, and accuracy. So it's better not just to hunt all this information and just plug everything that you have in the glossary and publish it, but definitely go through that reviewing process and make sure they're polished before they're consumed.
Let me add to this that Dataedo allows you to go through the physical data model and create the terms directly from columns or tables. So just right click, and that's how you can feed one way of feeding the glossary. But that should be fed into an inbox glossary, not to the production one, because these are just ideas, in my opinion. So that's one of ways of doing this from the data. Okay, let's get another one. This one is difficult. So how do you ensure individuals are following the right definitions?
Yeah, this is difficult. Thank you. Right. This is a tricky one, and this really goes along the lines of adoption. And this should ideally start before you're having that business glossary in place, right? So before you have that tool developed, deployed or developed, what have you, you should have those conversations with the stakeholders and identify the why. Why is such an asset needed for them, right? And that answer can differ from department to department, from even individual to individual. The answer to the why question is not the same from one to another, right? You want to make it relevant to them. So you want to find out really what are those challenges that they're dealing with, and see if you can tie the answers to those challenges back to a business glossary. It's really building in the whole adoption, right? Before you even started, you want to have people that are eager to have this accessible. You want to show what's in it for them, right? So I think as soon as you have that, you will encounter that issue far less. If that still happens, though, I mean, obviously communication also helps. Coming from the top, as why it's important, how this is affecting things, it's also important. So if they're using the wrong definition, even though the right one is there, it's defined, it's approved, you have to again show them what those consequences are. And it could be, inaccurate reporting. It could be doubling up on efforts. It could be many things, but definitely make it relevant to their own work, their own department, their own role.
Okay. What other attributes should I include? What is too many? Actually, two questions. The first one is quite open.
Right. It depends. So again, I would look at just including these, 9, 10 attributes to start with. They're enough just to get that adoption, but then you can put in things like an example, uses description, privacy classification, retention rules, related term names, even maybe reports where these are being surfaced. What's the system of record? You can then obviously tie it to that data dictionary and have it even more technical on what ETL processes are being used, data quality rules, the language that I mentioned. So yeah, there can be quite a few. What's too many? I think I mentioned this before, I've seen close to 100 this one organization. And I'm trying to actually get a hold of that list because I find it very interesting. It should always be evaluated, right? When you're adding something in, are you adding that attribute just because you want to track this one value for the one term, or is it 80% of the terms that this would be useful for? Or even though it might be for 20% of the terms, is it really providing that really critical information in there that without having it, it would not be as effective? So if there's a benefit associated with adding that attribute, yeah, you should have it in there. So it depends.
I would add that 101 is too much because Dataedo can handle only 100. So we have a limit. And yeah, I would say do not do an attribute, do not add it unless you need it, because that will slow you down. The more you need to agree on, the more it takes. So I would say just start with what George suggested and then add if you need something.
For sure. And also having, 50, 100 attributes, most of them will not be mandatory. And if they're not mandatory and people don't really see the value, even though they might plug in certain things in them, they would probably not do it for the most part.
Yeah. Next question. What do you do if an owner does not want to be an owner? Oh, actually, that's exactly the same as previous one. Would you like to add anything, or shall I move on?
Yeah, I think we've covered it.
Okay. How many terms should the first iteration of the glossary contain? Quite interesting.
Yeah, and again, I don't think it's really the size, the number that matters. It's really the quality of the terms. So start with 1, start with 5, and that's good enough if those terms are good, if those definitions are good, if they're providing value. One common mistake that a lot of organizations make, they're eager to get this tool out there, they're eager to populate this asset, and they hunt for this information, right? As I mentioned, from existing data dictionaries and reports and documentation, emails, conversations that they had with people, and they just plug it in there, make it available, and then it's really the Wild West. But what happens is, as soon as that Business Glossaries content is being consumed, when people see, well, maybe duplicates in definitions, spelling errors, things, definitions that are circular, things that don't make sense, they start losing trust in it, right? And they're thinking, well, okay, well, this is not good. This is really just a dump of things. Why should I come back here again? So I think that trust is quickly lost if you don't have good content in there, right? So better content is definitely more important than the number of terms that you would be starting with, and it's very hard to gain that trust back. So whatever you choose to start with, again, I think 1, 5 is good enough.
I've heard some people advise to do a glossary in a scope of specific project, or even that could be even a report. So if you're doing this one difficult report, define terms for that particular area. First, it's manageable, and the second, you have an actually incentive, and you get some value quickly. So instead of starting with organization-wide, you should start with some small project, because that can really have a small cycle before you actually build the entire glossary.
Absolutely, and to add to that, yes, looking at a specific project, specific report, or just a specific domain, as well. I think that's a great advice, Piotr. And really focusing on one of these really allows you to reach a critical mass quickly or quicker. It also makes the process of gathering in or modifying the terms easier, as you have less people to coordinate in. Yes, you start seeing those benefits faster, and it's definitely hard, right, when you start tackling organization-wide terms off from the start, like customer. That's a conversation that they can take months. So yes, if you're more specific, it's easier.
We have another one. Do you go down only for the attribute level, or would you also include KPIs in the business glossary as a reference for consumption by the business?
Do you go down only to the attribute level?
Yeah, so I think the question is, do you only look at the attributes, or would you like to have KPIs? My opinion is, of course, the KPIs are the very first thing I would go for, right? Because they are complex. You don't know how the calculation is, does an organization understand this KPI, right?
Absolutely. And again, you know, certain tools as well, or can also allow for to tie it in, as I mentioned, to the data dictionary, and then that can be tied into an even a data profiling tool or data quality tool, or you can tie it in with your existing KPI dashboards as well. So
And
one of the
reports.
yeah, because one of the attributes is that related report or dashboards, so you can have the links or the names in there of what's relevant to that term and just access it from there.
Okay, I think those were all the questions. Let's have a look at the poll again. So I'm not sure you can see it, but 60% are either planning or currently developing a glossary. So we have a good audience, I believe. And 20% already have a glossary. So I hope that will help those people expand on the glossary, add some fields that are not already there. And 20% do not have and are not planning. So maybe that will encourage them to actually convince the management to have a glossary.
I hope
But
so.
yeah, I think our first webinar about the introduction to a business glossary would be a good thing you could send to your boss or someone in your organization. Okay, George, thank you very much. That was very, very insightful. I hope everyone could get something out of it. That would be it.
Thank you. And please do follow up with us if you have any follow-up questions or even recommendations for our future webinars.
Yes, exactly. If you have any ideas of the things you'd like to learn, go ahead, answer to email you will receive, or go ahead and write us or comment on the video if you're looking at it on YouTube or somewhere else, because we'll publish it over there later. Okay, George and everyone, thank you very much. Hope to see you next time on one of the upcoming webinars. See you.
Bye.